My name is Thomas Allen Moon, and I'm the author of Payback: Why the Top 1% Must Invest in the Rest and How It Can Renew America. I wrote Payback to deal explicitly with an ongoing trend that politicians of all stripes have refused to admit exists. Over the last 40 years, the gap between what it costs to live the American dream and the market income of ordinary workers has widened from a gully to a canyon. This canyon now threatens the future of the middle class, and if nothing is done, Americans with ordinary skills will fall out of the middle class. Payback proposes a tax policy that will enable capitalism not only to save the middle class, but to grow and make it more prosperous. Since Payback digs deeply into the weeds, I've recorded this Q&A to give readers a quick take on it. To make this Q&A easier for readers to digest, I've divided it into 15 sections. Payback is free to read on a website that I've created for the convenience of readers. It's my hope that Payback will contribute to a national dialogue on tax policy that I believe will take place sometime in the next decade. Now let's get started with the Q&A. Part 6. Since tax preferences are clumsy, corrupt capitalism, and contribute to social inequity, social needs should be addressed directly. Question. We've covered your redistribution principle and how tax policy can be used to implement it. Let's turn to your second principle, the need to end tax policy's corruption of capitalism and contribution to social inequity. As I've said, capitalism is easily corrupted, and tax policy is a leading cause of corruption. For markets to function efficiently, they must allocate resources based solely on economic factors. Tax policy, however, has become a plaything of politicians who systematically use politics to override market pricing and allocating resources. Well, how does tax policy override markets and allocating resources? The key to capitalism's efficiency is market pricing unfettered by non-economic factors. Tax policies that change the price of goods and services or the return on investments from what they would have been without such policies distort how markets allocate resources. How do tax policies change the price of goods and services and the return on investments? There are over 200 tax preferences, which either lower the after-tax price of goods and services or increase the after-tax return on preferred investments as compared with their pre-tax prices or returns. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, lowering prices and increasing returns by enacting tax preferences distorts markets and gives preferred goods and services and preferred investments an unearned advantage over their competitors. What do you mean by unearned advantage? I mean an advantage unearned in the marketplace. In the literal sense, however, the advantage is earned. It's just that it's earned by lobbying politicians to award them with the advantage. It's an example of politicians, not market forces, picking winners and losers. Do you think that politics plays too big a part in tax policy? Most definitely. America pretends to have a capitalistic economy, but politics overriding natural market forces is what happens in socialistic societies. Since tax policy is the product of the political process, there's no way to keep politics out of it. But whenever politicians enact tax preferences that pick winners and losers differently than natural market forces would have picked, they should be called out and held accountable. Explain what tax preferences are. Tax preferences are those provisions buried in hundreds of pages of tax laws that confer special benefits on preferred groups of taxpayers. What's common to almost all tax preferences is that they benefit a preferred group by causing the after-tax price of preferred goods and services to be cheaper than their pre-tax price, and the after-tax return on preferred investments to be higher than their pre-tax return. Who's preferred and what's preferred are products of pure raw politics. Each tax preference divides taxpayers into two categories: those preferred taxpayers who benefit from the preference and all others who must pay for it. What do you mean when you say that non-preferred taxpayers pay for benefits that preferred taxpayers get? All tax preferences lose revenue. Since America taxes much less, about 6% of GDP, than it spends, all revenue losses add to the national debt. Someday the national debt will have to be repaid, and those who will have to pay it will be stuck with the tab for the cost of each tax preference. Now explain how tax preferences work. There are four major types of tax preferences: exclusions, deductions, credits, and preferential rates. Except for refundable credits, they all reduce the preferred taxpayer's liability if they spend their money on preferred goods and services or invest in preferred investments. Refundable credits are a means by which politicians use tax policy to redistribute income to preferred low and middle income taxpayers. That's awfully abstract. Can you give an example or two of each? Sure, let's take exclusions first. The most pervasive and costly tax preference of all is the employer-sponsored health insurance exclusion, which excludes from an employee's taxes the cost of their employer-sponsored health insurance. For employees to get a tax benefit, their employers must sponsor a health insurance program in which they participate. If there were no tax benefit, there'd be no reason for employers to become involved in their employees' health insurance. Well, what's so bad about employees getting a tax benefit because their employer provides their health insurance? Bad isn't the right word. Discriminatory, costly, and distorting are better words. This tax preference discriminates against taxpayers who don't work for large employers, saddles employers who sponsor health care plans with a financial burden that makes them less competitive, and skews consumer spending. Let's take these one by one. How does this tax preference discriminate against taxpayers who don't work for large employers? But for this tax preference, employers likely wouldn't be involved in their employees' health insurance, just as they aren't involved in their auto insurance. Since most taxpayers are employed by private employers, millions of them get their health insurance through their employer. Millions of other taxpayers whose employers don't sponsor health insurance or who are self-employed buy their health insurance in the individual market. This tax preference causes many low-risk taxpayers who buy their insurance in the individual market to suffer price discrimination relative to many high-risk taxpayers who are employed by large employers. Explain why this is happening. Health insurance is priced based on risk, and risk falls as the size of the risk pool rises. The size of the risk pools for employer-sponsored healthcare plans is determined by the number of employees an employer has. Employees of large employers, as a result, have a competitive advantage over both employees of small employers and the self-employed because they can participate in larger risk pools. Since premiums on plans with small risk pools are higher than those on plans with large risk pools, employees of large employers get a better deal than others. If risk pools were formed independently of an insured's employment, then the market would no longer discriminate against those who don't work for a large employer, and risk would be based on pure market factors. So employees of large employers get a special discount. Isn't that just the way of the world? That is the way of the world if you believe that exercising political influence is the way to get ahead, and frankly, lots of folks do. The only reason employers are involved in their employees' health care is because of the tax preference, a product of politics, not economics. Absent this tax preference, market factors, not politics, would allocate risk. All right, now explain how this tax preference saddles employers with a burden that makes them less competitive. Under free market economics, an employer pays compensation to its employees, and the employees decide how to spend it with no involvement from the employer. Employers now compete in global markets, and in most markets, businesses aren't involved in their employer's health insurance. An employer who sponsors a health insurance plan incurs costs in connection with organizing, funding, and administering it. Since these costs have nothing to do with the employer's core business, they put these employers at a competitive disadvantage against competitors who aren't burdened by these costs. Finally, explain how this tax preference skews consumer spending. This tax preference induces taxpayers to overspend on health insurance coverage because it credits dollar for dollar whatever they spend against their taxes. As a result, many participants, particularly high-income taxpayers, choose gold-plated plans that include low deductibles and copays with the broadest coverage available, such as full dental and vision care. The net effect of this tax preference is to encourage the overuse of health care by high-income taxpayers who can afford health care without any taxpayer help. You pointed out the discrimination against employees of small employers and the self-employed, the burdensome cost to employers, which makes them less competitive, and the overuse of health care by high-income taxpayers caused by this tax preference. And yet the republic still stands. What's the big deal? What makes it a big deal is it's the worst kind of problem. It's insidious. Coping with obvious problems is difficult enough, but coping with an insidious problem is next to impossible. What do you mean by insidious? It's like smoking. Some smokers, like my dear dad, smoked for years and enjoyed it without the slightest concern for their health. But then my dad died in the prime of his life of diseases directly related to smoking. This, together with other tax preferences, is like that. Their effects accumulate unnoticed over a long period of time, and then when it's too late, they inflict serious harm. Isn't that a little dramatic? It would be if this tax preference were the only one, but it isn't. There are more than 200, and taken together, they're like a ticking time bomb. Each tax preference has its own influential political constituency that protects it with the same ferocity of a lioness protecting her cubs. At some point, after it's too late, the danger that tax preferences pose to America's economy, financial security, and social and political stability will become all too obvious. Before getting into the danger tax preferences pose, give examples of other types of tax preferences. All right, let's take deductions. They differ from exclusions in two major ways. First, to qualify for deductions, a taxpayer must have total deductions in excess of the standard deduction. And second, deductions offset tax liability by the percentage of the amount of the deduction times the taxpayer's marginal tax rate. Leading deductions include medical costs, state and local taxes, home mortgage interest, and charitable contributions. In 2020, the standard deduction for a married couple filing jointly was $28,800, and tax rates range from a low of 10% to a high of 37%. Again, what's the big deal if taxpayers get a break for these types of expenditures? It's a big deal for about 10% of taxpayers, almost exclusively high-income taxpayers who qualify for deductions. But it's a raw deal for that 90% of taxpayers who don't, and for future generations of taxpayers who will someday have to pay higher taxes to make up for the revenue loss attributable to these deductions. It's worth asking, what's the justification for giving a costly tax break for a few politically determined deductions to a few high-income taxpayers when millions of low and middle income taxpayers incur these same types of expenses and get no tax break? I can't think of any. This is a classic example of misplaced social engineering, which helps the unneedy instead of the needy. What do you mean by social engineering? Social engineering is where the politicians decide there's a social problem that needs fixing and then enact a program to deal with it. For example, when the politicians determined that there were too many retirees who couldn't save enough to pay for their retirement or health care, then programs like Social Security and Medicare were enacted. Similarly, programs have been enacted to provide student aid, unemployment insurance, health care, affordable housing, and food stamps and other similar programs for those with low and middle income. Social engineering is what the politicians do when a social problem arises that capitalism cannot fix on its own. What do taxes have to do with social engineering? The short answer should be to first provide revenue to fund the social engineering that's enacted, and second, do no harm. What do you mean by do no harm? Most social problems stem from those with low and middle income being unable to afford something that society determines that they should have even if they can't afford it. Things like food stamps to avoid hunger, student aid for the next generation of workers to get a post-secondary education, health care, housing, and other similar needs. Taking less in taxes from the needy lessens the need to enact programs to provide them with what they can afford. What do tax breaks for those with high income have to do with harming those with low and middle income? Quite a bit. Every tax break for the unneedy loses revenue. Lost revenue either adds to the national debt or reduces the funding for programs for the needy. Adding to national debt squeezes funding for programs for the needy, which invites social unrest and political instability. You seem skeptical of using tax policy to fix social problems. You got that right. The purpose of taxation should be to raise revenue to pay for the cost of government and doing it in a way that doesn't discourage economic growth or lead to social inequity. Social problems confronting America should be attacked directly, not by tinkering with tax policy. Give some examples of how the government should cope with the types of social problems addressed by the deductions you listed. I'll take them one by one, starting with medical cost. Assuming it's the job of the government to soften the blow of medical cost, I believe that it should be done by using social insurance programs like Medicare, Medicaid, or the Affordable Care Act to cover these costs directly. For the most part, social insurance programs are more thoroughly means tested than deductions and therefore much less likely to help those who don't need it. Now, what, if anything, should be done about state and local taxes? The federal government funds a broad array of federal grant programs that provide hundreds of billions of dollars to states to help pay for functions such as education, healthcare, transportation, low-income housing, environmental matters, and many others. These grants mitigate the wealth disparity among the states and help ensure that states have the resources necessary to meet their needs. If one or more states believe that they're not getting enough federal aid, they can lobby to increase their grants. Beyond that, if a taxpayer chooses to live in a high-tax state, that's their choice. I don't believe that it's the federal government's job to indemnify taxpayers for their state and local tax liability, particularly high-income taxpayers who choose to live in high-income and high-tax states. What about home mortgage interest? This one's easy, at least in theory. It's a taxpayer's choice to rent or buy, and if they decide to buy, it's their choice about how expensive their home should be. The federal government has no business involving itself in that choice. And even if it did, it's a waste to make it easier for high-income taxpayers to buy expensive houses. In today's America, millions of low-income Americans, many of whom pay no income tax, need help paying for modest, decent housing. Federal grant programs targeted at the needy are better ways of meeting America's housing needs than providing a tax break to the unneedy to buy expensive houses. Finally, explain what's wrong with the charitable contribution deduction. Almost 90% of taxpayers get no benefit from this deduction, and yet most of them make charitable contributions every time they give to their church or other local nonprofit. This deduction benefits those with the highest income who can best afford to give and whose standard of living isn't cut by their philanthropic contributions. As with other deductions, every penny of revenue loss attributable to this deduction either deprives the government of funds necessary to meet unmet public needs or adds to the national debt. Does this mean you're against charitable giving? Certainly not. However, I think that high-income taxpayers, just like the almost 90% of taxpayers who get no benefit from their giving, should give as much as they can after paying their taxes. Tax incentives aren't necessary to encourage giving, despite fundraisers' tendencies to use such incentives to bill their cases to donors. In the late 19th century, robber barons such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and others donated huge amounts to charity when there were no tax benefits for giving. I believe that the multimillionaires and billionaires of today are no different. The likes of Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and others will contribute to charities because even after giving billions to their heirs, paying taxes, and making investments, there will still be billions left to support charitable causes. Again, I'm in favor of giving, but I believe that it should be done independently of tax incentives, particularly in a time of exploding national debt and trillions of unmet public needs. You made your views on deductions clear. Now explain what you think about credits. There are three major credits. The child credit, which helps taxpayers and non-taxpayers pay for the cost of child dependents. The earned income tax credit, which supplements the wages of low and middle income taxpayers and non-taxpayers. And the premium credit, which helps low and middle income taxpayers and non-taxpayers pay a part of the cost of health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. Unlike deductions, credits offset taxes dollar for dollar and don't have to exceed the standard deduction. I noticed that non-taxpayers are entitled to these credits. How can someone who doesn't pay taxes get a credit against their taxes? There are two types of credits, refundable and non-refundable. Refundable credits offset a taxpayer's tax liability, while non-refundable credits are paid even if the taxpayer doesn't owe any taxes. The explicit purpose of non-refundable credits is to redistribute income to non-tax-paying, low-wage workers who don't earn enough income to support their children, have a decent standard of living, or pay their own health insurance. These types of credits are attempts to mitigate the economic reality that capitalism doesn't always result in employers paying their employees a living wage. Since non-refundable credits provide a cash equivalent payment to non-taxpayers, how are these payments funded? Excellent point. Non-refundable credits are just a different name for government-issued and funded vouchers. Unlike refundable credits, which just offset a taxpayer's income tax liability, non-refundable credits are funded through appropriations because the taxpayer doesn't have enough income to offset the cost of the credit. You expressed doubt about using tax policy for social engineering, which in this case means supplementing the after-tax income of low-wage workers. What do you think about using credits for this purpose? Well, I think that capitalism's failure to assure that no able-bodied full-time worker will earn less than a living wage is an economic, social, and political problem that demands governmental action. A society in which millions of able-bodied full-time workers are mired in poverty is a drain on the economy, a social disgrace, and a political tinderbox. Instead of using tax credits to raise the standard of living for low and middle income workers, I believe there are much better ways. This concludes Part 6.